In this psychology revision video, we will review obedience from paper 2, topic 5, social influence. When it comes to obedience, there are a couple of things that we need to know for the exam. We need to know the exam definition. We need an obedience study, the evaluation of that study, and we need to know Milgram's agency theory of social factors, and we need to know Adorno's theory of the authoritarian personality. It's quite a big topic, this one, so we'll do our best to condense it down into this roughly 10-minute video. We'll start with the definition of the word obedience. It's an easy one to mix up in the exam. We simply cannot use the word obey, which is a common mistake. So a good exam definition goes like this. Obedience is following the orders of someone we believe to have authority. The key bits of the definition there are following orders and authority. Some examples of obedience might be taking medication because the doctor tells you to take it. Could be doing what a police officer says, what your parents say, or what a teacher says. All of these people are perceived to have some form of authority, and we often follow the orders that they give. The really famous study into obedience was done by Stanley Milgram, and it's the famous electric shock study. I won't read through it, but I'll leave it on the screen for a few seconds so you can have a refresher. Okay, it's a very easy study to get lost in and spend ages describing. So a really short way to describe it is like this on the left here. Basically, participants had to give increasingly powerful electric shocks to a confederate every time they got a question wrong. And when they wanted to stop the experiment, to put the pressure on through their authority, when they said the experiment requires you continue. It's very easy to get lost in a huge narrative of setting this study up, but that is all you need for a method. Okay, in terms of evaluating this study, again, there's quite a lot that we can talk about. Obviously, all done in a lab, so we have the normal positives of lab control, extraneous variables under control. But the main thing is how standardized this study has been and how many times it has been repeated with the same results. It's actually very difficult to get a group of participants together now who don't know this study because it's so famous. However, this does mean that it's an incredibly reliable study because it happens the same every single time. On the negatives, this study really lacks ecological validity. It's a very unnatural task, and knowing that people are part of a study, chances are they may have continued very unnaturally, knowing that their behaviour was having no real consequences. There are also some reports that participants were genuinely suspicious about the electric shocks, so maybe their behaviour wasn't completely natural. Of course, the ethics in this study broken were huge. Psychological harm, I mean, the participants, some of them thought that they may have killed somebody. They weren't allowed to leave, so right to withdraw is the biggest one that was broken, and also deception all the way through. The participants were being lied to. The study that Milgram did massively influenced the creation of his agency theory of social factors. And one of the main reasons he came up with this theory is because he thought he had discovered that one of the key reasons why people obeyed and followed orders from authority figures, and it was to do with the idea of responsibility. So to understand Milgram's agency theory, we first need to know two words, and those two words are the autonomous state and the agentic state. The autonomous state is when we feel responsible for our own actions, and we are normally in this state. It is the normal day-to-day state that we are in. We feel responsible for everything that we are doing. However, there are times throughout our life where we will be in what Milgram calls the agentic state, and that is when we are following an order from somebody else. And because we're following somebody else's order, we no longer feel that we are responsible for what we're doing. So the way that it works is quite simple. It's like this. When an authority figure gives us a strict order, we go through something called the agentic shift, which means we move from our normal autonomous state to the agentic state, and we no longer feel responsible for what we do. And that explains why people might follow such horrendous orders and doing things that they wouldn't normally do, because they don't feel responsible for the actions that they're doing. Now, there are a number of factors that can increase the chances of the agentic shift happening and us entering the agentic state, and we need to know these in case they come up in the exam, or in case we need to apply them to certain situations. So those factors are social factors, because agency theory is a theory of social factors, and the first two social factors are authority and culture. Firstly, if a person has legitimate authority, we are more likely to enter the agentic state. So much more likely to enter the state if a police officer in uniform tells us to do something, compared to if a police officer off duty tells us to do something, because the uniform gives the legitimate authority. Also, culture. We live in a culture where we are brought up from a very young age, and we are taught to obey certain people like doctors and teachers and the police. So if you have experience in that from a young age, you're also more likely to go into the agentic state when given an order. We also have proximity. Proximity literally just relates to how close you are to something, and we have found that the closer the person is to you, the more likely you are to obey them. And buffers. So a buffer is something that blocks your sight from sort of seeing the consequences of your actions. So if you can see the results of your actions, you are less likely to obey, because you actually see the horrible things that you're doing to somebody. So if you think about the Milgram study, there was a massive wall in the way. You couldn't actually see what the Confederate was doing, so we couldn't see them suffering. So we didn't see the consequences of what we were doing. So we were more likely to keep going and go higher and higher on the electric shock machine. We could also say that would also link to possibly Nazi Germany and the horrendous gas chambers, which we've talked about in class. When the gas chambers were closed, the soldiers were unable to see the actual consequences of what they were doing, because there was a buffer in the way. The doors were shut and the walls were blocking. So both of these, proximity and buffers, were present in Milgram's study. The experimenter in the white coat was very close, and the wall was blocking people from seeing what they were doing. Okay, so what can we say about agency theory in terms of evaluation? There's quite a few things again. On the positives, we've got lots of real-life evidence of agency theory happening. So I've mentioned Nazis already. So Nazi Germany, we have evidence from real life that lots of people were able to shift into an agentic state and follow truly horrible orders from the government and from the commanding officers, really showing that Milgram's idea does happen in real life. Milgram's own experiment supports his theory, because in his experiment, 65% of people went all the way to 450 volts to the end of the voltmeter just because somebody told them to. However, that was only 65%, so the study isn't 100% accurate. So in Milgram's study, we have 35% of people who did not. They stopped at about 300 volts. So that would suggest to us that there's another explanation of obedience. There's something that Milgram's not quite understood, or something that Milgram's not quite explained, which links us nicely to our final evaluation. It could be that there's something in our disposition that stops us from following orders blindly, maybe something like our personality or something like that. So lots to say about agency theory. After agency theory, we learned about Adorno's theory. Adorno's theory of the authoritarian personality. Now, Adorno was interested in obedience, just like Milgram, on the back of World War II. However, he disagreed with Milgram. He didn't think that social factors were the only thing that made a person obedient. He thought it came from your disposition, specifically your personality. He said if you had the authoritarian personality, you would be a very obedient person. Now, he categorized this quite specifically And this list here is an extensive list of how he would describe a person with an authoritarian personality. In the exam, you'd probably need to be able to say about 3 of them if you ever had to describe the authoritarian personality. Firstly, if you have an authoritarian personality, you have exaggerated respect for authority figures. You're more likely to obey orders. You look down on people below you who are inferior to you. You have quite a black and white rigid cognitive style. So, when it comes to answering things or having opinions, it's black or white, it's this or that. There's no in between. Very traditional in viewpoints. These people with authoritarian personalities have very strict upbringings in their childhoods, where the parent only gave them conditional love. They don't like change. And because their parents only gave them conditional love, they feel quite a lot of anger towards their parents. But because they respect them greatly, they can't take that anger out on them, so they displace it towards other people. Usually, they're more likely to displace that and scapegoat that towards people of an inferior status to them, and this helps them relieve their anxieties and things like that. So scapegoating is simply offloading your negativity to those around you who are inferior to you. So that's an extensive list of the authoritarian personality characteristics, and we covered in class that you could find out if you had this personality type by completing Adorno's F-scale questionnaire. The F-scale questionnaire caused a lot of problems for us anyway. Here are 3 examples of questions from the F-scale, and hopefully you can already start to remember why we had some serious concerns and serious problems with this F-scale. When it comes to evaluating Adorno's theory of the authoritarian personality on obedience, we had 3 main things to talk about. Firstly was the fact that it is largely based on this F-scale. We had lots of problems with the F-scale. It was a very biased questionnaire. It almost forced people to agree with it. It was very confusing. The questions often didn't make sense, and it's very outdated. So all of these problems with the F-scale would suggest that the data that he created and collected wasn't necessarily very trustworthy. So if the whole data collection is not trustworthy, and the whole theory is based on the F-scale data, we have to then question the actual validity of the theory. Maybe he's wrong. He says that obedient people have an authoritarian personality, but we have lots of evidence of people who are obedient who do not have the authoritarian personality. So again, it is suggesting to us that obedience is coming from somewhere else. Maybe this suggests that Milgram may have been right. Maybe it's a case of different people are obedient for different reasons. And finally, his focus on disposition was limited to that of a personality. But we have covered in lessons that there is actually a lot of research out there that says there's another dispositional factor, intelligence, which can determine how obedient a person is. It turns out that people who are very intelligent are less likely to obey and follow orders, whereas people with lower intelligence are more likely to blindly follow orders because possibly they can't quite think for themselves and think about the consequences of their actions. Just to summarise then, in this video we have covered the definition of obedience. We've looked at Milgram's famous obedience study, we've evaluated the study, and we have outlined and evaluated both Milgram's agency theory and Adorno's authoritarian personality. I hope that was a useful video, guys, and you've revised your obedience, and I'll see you in the next video.